So then as people come in. All right, good evening, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. I'm just going to give a second for everyone to pile in the webinar. So while everyone's doing that, I want to just say thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Danny. I'm the program coordinator for the Office of Cancer Research, Training, and Education at Karmanos Cancer Institute. And we are very pleased to have another of our quarterly book clubs here on health equity. And so without all the to-do, I want to just give you some little announcements. We do have the chat feature open. So if you would like to leave a message and send questions to our panelists, feel free to do that. I might have to adjust some settings because I'm not quite seeing it, but we will get started and it will turn on in a moment. So if while our panelists are talking, it triggers a question for you, feel free to put it in the box that will appear in a moment. And then we will have time for questions as we go along. So thank you so much for coming. And here's our moderator for the evening is Dr. Michael Simon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Danny. And as I see participants are starting to arrive, I will do a welcome message and hopefully we'll fill up the room as the time goes on. So my name is Michael Simon. I'm a medical oncologist at the Karmanos Cancer Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the third quarterly KCI Health Equity Book Club, where we will be discussing the book, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by Robin DiAngelo. It's inspiring to see the continued interest in a Cancer Center-sponsored book club, which I feel bodes well for us as a community of healthcare providers, patients, and family. When you think about it, all of us as health providers, basically all of us, at some time in our lives, will join the ranks of our patients and family members as patients ourselves or as caring for loved ones. And we all share the same hope that the provider sitting across from us in our usual spot will meet us with an open mind and who is a healthcare professional that is willing to make the effort to better understand us as a person, no matter what our race, ethnicity, religion, or sexual orientation. This type of empathetic provider-patient relationship is what I hope to promote through the Health Equity Book Club, where reading books about societal challenges puts us all on a level playing field. Before we begin, I would like to thank Danny Inman, Program Coordinator for the Karmanos Office of Cancer Research, Training, and Education, Michelle Cote, Associate Center Director for Career Enhancement, as well as committee members, Dr. Lita Mack, Laura Zubik, and Christine Kilborn for their tireless efforts in moving this program forward. Please note that as a participant, there's no requirement for you to have previously read the book. I will provide a brief overview in a few minutes, which will be followed by our panel discussion. There will be ample time for questions, which will be taken through chat. And I'm sure there will also be a robust discussion on the chat occurring at the same time. I hope that afterwards you go out and purchase the book. I think it's worth the read. So I will take a breath and look at our count and get moving with the presentation. So I was given the challenge or took the challenge of summarizing the book. And I quickly found out that summarizing a book isn't so easy. So White Fragility, why is so hard? This is a hard book with a hard message. Yes, this book tells us how it is. From the introduction, and I quote, "The United States was founded on the principle that all people are created equal." The basic message of the book, however, is that racism is alive and strong, and that all of us white people, yes, every one of us who identifies as part of the white race, have a hard time dealing with the topic of racism. In other words, white people have a hard time acknowledging any complicity or taking responsibility for perpetuating the culture of racism in America. So that maybe sums up the book. Looking back at the other books in our series, I believe that this book provides us a unique and timely challenge. In Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington, our first book, we read about the history of racism in medicine, which chronicles the legacy of unethical and illogical misdeeds carried out by white doctors on their Black patients. In our second book, Caste, by Isabel Wilkerson, Caste, the Origins of Our Discontents, we learned about how racism is ingrained in society and compared the American version of caste to the caste system imposed on European Jews during and before World War II, and the societal implications of 4 hierarchical ranked castes in India. Today's book brings the topic full circle back to the white race. I believe that our situation is nicely exemplified by the phrase, "We have met the enemy, and he," and I'll add she, "is us." This phrase, derived from a War of 1812 quote, was first used on a poster in 1970 to promote Earth Day, later used by Walt Kelly in his cartoon strips, but this perhaps is a major lesson from the book. In a recent discussion about the book, a friend of mine said, and I paraphrase, "What business does this person have telling me how to act?" This person, meaning Robin DiAngelo, the author, she is also white, an affiliate associate professor of education at the University of Washington, seems to have a lot of experience with sociology. She has over 2 decades of experience in leading discussions and workshops on interracial dialogue. Yes, she appears to have done due diligence in exploring her own defenses of innocence and reaction to people of color. In her work, she has directly experienced a negative, angry, guilty, and defensive reaction from many white participants. Let me draw you into the book by defining a few concepts. First of all, I'll talk about individualism and objectivity from chapter 1. Chapter 2 discusses the white racial frame, and chapter 5 discusses white solidarity. I will end by reading a short section from chapter 12 and a few tips for discussion. So first of all, what is individualism and objectivity? Individualism is the belief that we are each unique and stand apart. Objectivity tells us that it's possible to be free of all bias. Why are these concepts problematic for us in terms of race relationships? Individualism claims that there are no intrinsic barriers to individual success, and that failure is not a consequence of social structures, implying that race is irrelevant. Of course, we know that we all have to work hard as individuals to succeed, but in addition, we all know that each of us occupies distinct race, gender, and social class. In other words, it makes a difference to be the son of Bill Gates in our society. In our society, it also makes a difference to be white. In regards to objectivity, the book suggests that it's impossible for any of us to be free of bias, and that we are all raised in particular social circumstances by our parents and family, television, movies, jokes, religion. We actually, researchers at Karmanos, amongst many of us, have cataloged in a newly, in a in-press review article, how physicians, at least in our downtown campus, exhibit implicit bias against Black patients, implying that we are not completely objective. What about the term white racial frame? This was coined by a sociologist to describe how whites reinforce racial messages that position whites as superior in culture and achievement. This frame is felt to be deep and extensive and supported by white-dominated social institutions and the fact that in the United States, whites are disproportionately enriched compared to all the others. For example, in 2018, the US Congress was 90% white. And in that same year, owners of men's professional football teams were 97% white, and we could go on with other institutions dominated by whites. A few questions to ask ourselves in regards to our own racial or white racial framing. 1, what was the earliest time that you were aware that people from other racial groups existed? 2, if you are white, Did your parents have many friends of color? And if not, why not? 3, what made a school good or bad? Did it have anything to do with the racial makeup of the school? Or for that matter, a neighborhood good or bad? Can you go through the neighborhoods in your city and tell us about the racial makeup of the neighborhoods and the circumstances in those neighborhoods? Okay, my last concept, white solidarity. This is the unspoken agreement among whites to protect white advantage and not cause another white person to feel racial discomfort by confronting them when they say or do something racially problematic. How many times have we experienced the offhand racially based biased joke at home or at work? Do we fall into a code of silence compelled by the desire not to break with the norm or not to be labeled as, oh, they're just being politically correct or they're just being combative? Was it racial solidarity when a white friend of mine mentioned that they grew up in a Northwest Detroit neighborhood until the neighborhood went, quote, to pot? Of course, a neighborhood going to pot is a euphemism for when Blacks moved in. And as part of the pattern of white flight that has been seen over the generations in many American cities, it's documented to have occurred even when only 6% of the neighborhood became inhabited by Blacks. Was my silence after that discussion motivated by not wanting to hurt someone's feelings? Was I exhibiting white solidarity? I'd like to finish my comments by bringing you into the book. And I read from chapter 12. And this is DiAngelo speaking. The equity team has been invited to a meeting with the company's new web developer. So she's part of an equity team that goes around and tries to promote equity. The team consisted of 2 women, both of whom are Black, and me, DiAngelo, who is white. The new web developer, who is also Black, wants to interview us so that she can build our page. She starts the meeting by giving us a survey to fill out. Many questions on the survey inquire about our intended audience, methods, goals, and objectives. I, meaning DiAngelo, find the questions tedious and feel irritated by them. Pushing the survey aside, I try to explain verbally. I tell the developer that we go out into the satellite offices to facilitate anti-racism training. I add that the training is not always well received. I say, in fact, one member of our team was told not to come back. Then I make a joke. The white people were scared by Deborah's hair. Deborah is Black and has long locked braids. The meeting ends and we move on. So what about what she did at this meeting was problematic? Maybe commenting on a physical trait such as hair is especially insensitive for Black women involved in interracial dialogue. Maybe it's wrong for this white person to think that she can meet a Black person for the first time and make a racially tainted joke. Also, the web developer later told her, by pushing aside my material and dismissing it, that really offended me. The web developer told DiAngelo that she spent her life justifying her intelligence to white people. Okay, so 3 points to guide the discussion. There's a really nice discussion guide connected with this book. 1, a strong opinion is not the same as informed knowledge. 2, when discussing complex social and institutional dynamics such as racism, consider what I don't agree may actually mean I really don't understand. And lastly, our racial position will greatly affect our ability to see racism. I like the following swimming metaphor. If we swim against the current of racial privilege as a Black person or a person of color, it's often easier to recognize racism, while as a white person, it's harder to recognize if we are swimming with the current. So that, I hope, does some justice to summarize the book. And I believe we are a little bit ahead of schedule. So I'm going to introduce each of our panelists. And what we've decided to do, as Danny said, is to take questions on the chat, but not to interrupt the speakers. So let the speakers speak. We'll go through the panelists, and then we'll have an open discussion. So we're very happy to welcome our 4 panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Mark Schweitzer. He is Vice President of Health Affairs at Wayne State University and Dean of the Wayne State University School of Medicine. He has a responsibility for clinical training of all health-related students. He is also an accomplished musculoskeletal radiologist and academic leader. He's given over 500 invited talks, now 501, in nearly 35 countries. He has published 400 peer-reviewed papers and has also served as editor-in-chief of a major international MRI journal for nearly a decade. Dr. Schweitzer, please take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So reading the book, a lot of specific words came into my mind, and I wanted to start out with those words and then explain my internal reaction to each of those words. So one word was mentioned previously, meritocracy. One is classification. One is racism. One is prejudice. One is bias. One is perspective. And one is disinhibition. And I'm not going to take them all in that order, but let me start out with meritocracy, which I think is one of the key flaws in the American psyche. Basically, you are successful because of the zip code you were born in. And there are very few people who become successful who are not from a zip code where people who are successful already live. And I believe one of the great flaws in American character and why I believe so much in state universities like Wayne State is there's very few ways to overcome meritocracy. And state universities are one of the leading ways to do that. And it's a manifestation of bias, which is the second word I want to talk about. There are all different kinds of biases, and we all have them. And I always thought as a radiologist, because I spend my life looking at people on the inside, that we should have less biases than anyone else. And I think no one has less biases than anyone else. They may be different. And I think the best we can do is bring them to the surface and to become conscious of them. If you look at the ERAS form for medical residencies, one of the questions that they ask is the education level of your parents and where they work. And I find that question so deeply disturbing. What the hell does it matter that my parents may not have gone to college? Or in one young woman who I was interviewing, her mother was a corrections officer. And the argument the AAMC gives is we want to see how far the student has progressed beyond what they may have been predestined to do based upon their zip code. And I think that that's a fallacious argument, because by looking at that, you're just bringing all your unconscious biases to the surface, not quite to make them conscious, but enough to make you more aware and potentially negatively act on them. So one helpful thing, as the next word is perspective, is to just be exposed to different thoughts, different groups of people, different ideologies, and different perspectives. And the most helpful thing to this book was it gave me a different perspective than I was used to. And that goes to disinhibition. And many of you know my politics, but I think, to be honest, that Fox News is kind of a manifestation of disinhibition, that it gives people safe corner to express certain thoughts or ideas that society has acculturated as being things that shouldn't be expressed. And society has acculturated this for a reason, because they're negative for society. But I think we live in an environment where disinhibition has become almost an ethos. So it gives people succor to say thoughts that previously in society would have been considered unacceptable to express, equally unacceptable to think, but certainly unacceptable to express. And then classification. I think it was Albert Einstein who said intelligence is the ability to classify things. And I think that leads us to classify too much. I used to work in Canada, some of you know this, and one of my first days in Canada, I'm giving one of those 500 invited lectures, and I'm showing a case of sickle cell disease. And the resident had a lot of trouble with the finding. And so I said, this is a 29-year-old African-American. And I caught myself, and I go, up in Canada, I go, African-Canadian patient. And they looked at me like I was from outer space. So I said, what would be the appropriate terminology? And they said, Canadian. And it taught me that we classify things because it makes us easier. And that classification is one thing that leads to biases. And then the last thought is the distinction between racism, bias, and prejudice. And I do think the book educated me that racism is a systemic issue. It's the way society, the legal system, institutions are constructed to maintain the status quo so that your kids will be successful because of the zip code that they're in. And that's the systemic construct that we have that I think everyone here aspires to overcome to the degree that we can. And racism equals bad, as said by DiAngelo, because it's a systemic factor. Prejudice permeates pretty much everything that we do, much of what we say, much of what we believe. And bias is similar, but for some reason the word has a less of a negative connotation. And perhaps as scientists, because we use bias in a scientific way, and we never use prejudice, at least in a medically scientific way. But to some degree, it gives an exit to be biased, because we have population biases in research, we may have gender biases in research, and we explain them as a limitation and sometimes explain that away. But as Dr. Simon introduced me, one of my hats is an editor, and sometimes bias is a limitation of a paper, but often it's a fatal flaw. And when I think about bias in society, it's a fatal flaw. And it's not just a limitation. And if you become conscious of it, you can make that fatal flaw a limitation. And book clubs like this and discussions like this help us do that and become less disinhibited. So those were my initial thoughts.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for leading off the panel, Mark. Okay, so I'm going to now introduce Taylor Barrow. She's an MD candidate in the Wayne State University School of Medicine class of 2024. Of course, we're all proud of her. She grew up on the east side of Detroit, and she attended Mercy High School in Farmington Hills. Tracy attended Boston University, where she graduated in 2016, receiving a dual degree in sociology and biology. After college, Tracy entered the nonprofit social work career path, where she thought she would spend her life. She served as a director of community programs at Carolyn House Incorporated in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and also devoted much of her work to community organizing, partnering with numerous organizations. Tracy has a master's degree in medical science from the University of Vermont and matriculated this past summer as a first-year medical student, and so she's now probably a second-year medical student at Wayne. She's a member of the Aesculapian Honor Society, and I hope I didn't mess that word up too much, Healing Between the Lines Curriculum Committee, and president of the Black Medical Association. Taylor, welcome to the panel.
Thank you so much. I apologize. I just got a notification that my internet is unstable. So if I go out, can someone just either message me or just let me know? But thank you so much for that introduction. And I just wanted to share some of my thoughts around this book. I shared this earlier, but as a Black woman, this book was very much water is wet, right? It is something that is ingrained into my birth. It was ingrained into my everyday. And so a lot of the themes here, like the book states, is meant to address white folks on the reality of what folks of color go through. So I'm not going to spend too much time harping on the themes because I think the book itself is a tool to revert back to. My main concern with this audience that I have here today, and that's something I want to open up for discussion, is a lot of folks read things like this and they're like, well, what do I do next, right? And actually DiAngelo, the author, has a really great comeback for that. It's, she says, well, how have you managed to get this far and not know, right? And so I want to kind of talk about that point. How have you managed to get this far and not know? And kind of harp on the reasons as to what folks can do next. And a lot of that lies in power. And so I think something that the book speaks to very well is just that racism is a system, right? It's an insidious system. And so that you don't have to do the work in order to benefit from it as a white person, right? You're going to have some holds of power regardless, because that is the nature of the system. And when it comes to figuring out, okay, what do I do? How do I atone for this? To me, it seems like you have to address the ways in which you are able to give up power. And I think about that a lot in our medical education. And my bio, you're right, is a little outdated. I'm now a second-year medical student, just had an exam today. Like I said before, don't ask me anything about rheumatoid arthritis because you probably have it, I don't know. But when it comes to speaking about the medical education system, something that I've become really impassioned by is kind of calling out the power dynamics that exist. And so how are we as doctors trained to establish these power dynamics, and how does that sort of manifest in the patients that we see, specifically in our Black patients with a city like Detroit? And a lot of that comes with the acknowledgement of history. And so I think it's important when well-meaning white folks, specifically in the healthcare sector, are treating minority populations, that they acknowledge this history and acknowledge the power, because that is actually how you're going to be able to heal the whole patient. Someone brought up earlier how it's sort of disheartening to see how much of the Black community does not want to get vaccinated, right? They're kind of rejecting the moment of, being vaccinated for COVID-19. And I think we do a disservice if we are just disheartened and saddened by that without acknowledging the history of vaccination and healthcare that Black folks historically have. I have family members who knew folks who were in Tuskegee, right? I have family members who knew the history of Detroit and their healthcare and their doctors, and the closing of the Black hospitals. And all of these things have huge ramifications as to how patients are going to show up to us every day. So how are we as doctors going to challenge and accept that power dynamic? Comes with a few things. First off, I believe in medical education, we have to decolonize how we teach our medical students, right? I think, all of these notions of having publications and all of these things, a lot of it is very parental when it comes to being established within the community. And by parental, I mean, a lot of times doctors will open up clinics, right? We'll give extra hours, and we'll publish research about the disparities within COVID-19 vaccines or diabetes or heart disease, right? And so as I'm being educated, I'm being told as a medical student, okay, if you have an African-American patient, they're probably going to have worse GFR rates in their kidney. They're probably going to have hypertension. They're probably going to have diabetes. That is harmful, right? If I'm just being taught and just assuming medical conditions based off of someone's race, right? And that's harmful. Race itself is not biologic, but it is a very real sociological phenomenon. How do we change that power dynamic? Because as a physician coming into a hospital, you have that person's health, you have that power in your hands, right? How do we address that? To me, it comes from doing the work to understand the history, right? Folks, African-American women or African-Americans in general don't just have hypertension because that's just the way that their biology is. that comes from a long history of slavery, of Jim Crow, of being, told that they can't go to the doctor, of having to figure out, where their next meal is coming from, or just not having access to proper fruits and vegetables in their own neighborhoods. So we as clinicians have to acknowledge that. We have to have that coming in as we see our patients, right? We have to acknowledge the power dynamic of, it's not just, oh, they're gonna have hypertension. It's the fact that society has created an environment that is high stress, high allostatic load, and it's taking a toll on their bodies. So that power dynamic first has to be called out. The second is, what are ways in which we can allow minority populations to infiltrate these systems, right? So I think a major part and radical change that this book is sort of getting at amongst white folks is, what are ways in which I can give up my power? Because historically, African Americans or other folks of color have not been in the same rooms that I'm in, right? Specifically in medicine, what does it look like in medical education? How many faculty of color are we having on our staff? I know as a second year, I can count on my hand how many Black faculty I have. And I know for sure, because as soon as I open that lecture, I'm like, wow, that's awesome, right? How do we get at that power dynamic? How are we making sure that more African-American students, specifically at a school, that's in the inner city, in Detroit, right? How do we make sure that we're training more doctors from the community? I intentionally wanted to come here, and I know it says in my bio, I went to Boston, I went to Vermont, I've been all over the place. I intentionally came back to Detroit to be trained as a doctor, only to find that it's such a different world than I grew up in, right? It's such a different environment, and I'm down the street from East Jefferson, where I'm from, right? So how do we open up our gates into academia, establishing that dismantling that power rather, and letting in more folks of a diverse background that are more representative of the community that we serve? And then lastly, how do we as medical providers and within medical education make the environment safer for both our minoritized students as well as our patients? This looks like pouring our money into resources that are actually going to help minoritized students and community members. For Healing Between the Lines, for instance, a curriculum that we started at Wayne State, we actually bring in community activists and nonprofits, and they teach us about, we had a nonprofit called Detroit Heal Detroit, which is a youth-led organization talking about generational trauma. They came in and talked to us about, the type of healthcare that they desire, what it means to have a teenager who has just gone through, either gun violence or some other sort of violence. What do they want to hear? So it takes turning that power dynamic on its head, right? We're not only, learning from, high level academics, we're also learning from community members because they both have equal input into our education. And so I don't want to go too much over time, and I apologize if you hear squeaking. My puppy Nelson has a new squeaker toy that he's decided to bring out right now. But in the end, I think the overall ethos of this book, especially for white folks listening, is what are ways in which I hold power, and then how willing am I to give that power up in order to benefit minoritized populations going forward, right? Am I able to speak up? Am I able to take off someone else's position? Am I able to bring in a community member? What have you? I really encourage, after reading this book and figuring out what to do next, seek the different power dynamics that you have and sort of kind of grapple with them and figure out ways in which you can distribute your power to folks who historically have not had it.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, moving along, our next panel member is Dr. Barbara Wolfe. Dr. Wolfe is a health psychologist who's currently the corporate director of behavioral health education and physician wellness for McLaren Healthcare Corporation. She has been involved in academic affairs for almost 30 years and has been an associate program director in the family medicine residency program at McLaren Flint, as well as a program director of health psychology postdoctoral fellowship in Flint. She began her career working at Detroit General and helped found the original Rape Counseling Center through Detroit General Hospital and the Detroit Police Department. Dr. Wolfe is also associate professor at Michigan State University College of Human Osteopathic Medicine in the Departments of Family Medicine and Psychiatry. Barbara, welcome to the panel.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here today. And thank you, Taylor. I actually wanted to start by talking about what happens to medical students being involved both in undergraduate and primarily graduate medical education. Recent studies show that 38% of unrepresented medical students, could be Black, it could be Asian, have experienced some kind of microaggressions, and about 20% of them are related to race and ethnicity. Now, that's every fifth person in a class or in a residency class who's experiencing some kind of microaggressions that they're probably not talking to us about. So so I just wanted to start there, and I think that's kind of where you left off. So I had a very difficult time reading this book, and it was written for progressive white people, which I consider myself to be one of those. And it was difficult for me because it made me uncomfortable, not about the material, but about the way that I was being lectured to about how to be a person thinking about discrimination. So one of the things that I did besides reading the book was that I talked to many colleagues, both white and people of diverse backgrounds, and had very interesting conversations about it. And but I also looked at the reviews, the book reviews of this particular book, both written by white people and written by Black people, and they were quite different. And white people primarily liked the book and found it helpful and interesting. And the reviews I read by Black literary folk were more nuanced, in which they talked about how they felt diminished by the book, that it was demeaning to them, and that they didn't need somebody to tell white people how to talk to them. So I thought that was interesting. The other thing that I did was I watched Whitewashed, which is a 30-minute video about being white. And one of the persons said, a quote which I really liked, and it's a quote by Malcolm X, and that person said, "Racism is like a Cadillac. There's a new model every year." And I think that that's really true, and for us to be able to understand that is really important. It's everywhere, every year. But there were a couple things in the book that I thought were helpful. And one was, we've already talked about a little bit, which is about the morality of racism, and that what we like to think about is that it's not us. It's the people in Charlottesville. It's the people down south in the civil rights movement that mistreated people, and that those are bad people. And I don't think I'm a bad person, and my friends are not bad people, so we can't be racist. But it's the implicit bias that you know, it's what we don't see. It's the unconscious. It's how we act out in our world. You know, we know that it happens not just with race, it happens with people who are obese, right? You put two people together, one's heavy, one's not heavy, who gets the job? It's the thinner person. So we have many different biases, and but certainly the one of racist thinking and unthinking, you know, the things that we're not even aware of, I think that are really important for us to pay attention to. And the other thing that I thought was interesting was thinking about white supremacy as a global infrastructure. And I didn't think of white supremacists or white supremacy in that way before, because I could individualize it. But if you think of white supremacy as a way that we have built this country, it was based on enslaved people taking care of us, essentially, and building our buildings and taking, you know, growing our food, and that's white supremacy. And it's not individual actions, although that's also true. So I thought that that was really helpful for me to think of it that way, that it's the infrastructure. And then lastly, there was, I just wanted to read part of what John McWhorter, who wrote The Dehumanizing Condensation of White Fragility. He's a Black writer, and he says that, let's see, and maybe I won't do that, never mind. Let me see. So one of the things that they talked about in Whitewashed was, and in this video, they go around and just ask white people questions about being white. And one of the questions was, when did you figure out you were white? When did you know you were white? And as opposed to the question of when did you just remember or just realize that people are a different color from you? This was, when did you become white was the question. And that was a really interesting question because people hadn't really considered that, right? They could consider when they first realized there was difference between people, but not their own white skin. And you know, we know that we're white because we have people to be different than us, and so that was pretty interesting. And you could go into what we talked about in medical apartheid in terms of we needed to have race in order to enslave people, right? We needed to have difference between white and Black so that we could have privilege and others could not. And then lastly, there was a discussion about people that immigrated to America and how did they become white in terms of Irish and Italian who weren't considered to be white when they arrived. And what happened is that they gave up their language. They stopped eating their special foods. They became like wasps. I mean, that was, you know, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants was the ideal. And so there was a loss of the self just by the immigration way that people came into the country, and Blacks and people of color don't have the opportunity to become white. You know, we know that because they're not white. And so I think that those are kind of important dynamics to consider that we don't often. And my last statement is that I loved thinking about the fact of flesh-colored bandages and flesh-colored crayons because I have taken out you know, they're in crayon boxes, they're in bandage boxes, and you take it out. And if you're a white person, you don't think that, well, of course it's a white bandage, right? But if you're anybody else, you look at a flesh-colored bandage and it doesn't belong to you. So, I found it interesting, helpful, and all of that, I guess, that I've already said. So I think that I could stop there. And I really look forward to the conversation with all of us, actually, about this book.
Great, thank you so much. We are doing so well keeping on schedule. I'm so impressed. It's almost like we rehearsed. And we did have the privilege of speaking together a little bit before the meeting, which is maybe helping it flow so well. So we're going to go to our last panelist, Dr. Brad Rope, of course, last but not least. Brad grew up in the panhandle of Nebraska on the Wyoming border before earning his Bachelor of Science at the University of Nebraska and medical degree at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. He came to Michigan State for his internal medicine residency and then began his journey in internal medicine, starting as a nocturnalist in Lansing. I haven't heard that description recently. Hospitalist in Albuquerque, and returned to East Lansing to join a large private internal medicine group where his practice includes multiple venues of medicine, from the ICU, the hospital, subacute rehab, home health care, hospice, and office-based practice. He also served as Chief Medical Officer of Consumers Mutual Insurance through Obamacare, before settling into his current role as the Chief Medical Officer for McLaren Medical Group. Welcome, Dr. Rope.
Thank you, Dr. Simon. A pleasure to be here and talk with everybody. I'm going to start. I did a little experiment with the book to start with, is I actually, just for fun, decided to query several of my friends and tell them that I was reading a book on white fragility, just to see their facial expressions, just to gauge how they would look at it. And I consider most of my colleagues and friends I ask, they're professional, highly educated. I'd say that they're the progressive white individual, particularly white male, that I'd say is part of the target audience of the book with this. And you can tell by just the facial expressions without even words how uncomfortable the topic just brings this out. And I know for me personally, and I think I heard Barb say it earlier, that, you know, this is an uncomfortable read for me, but I think also a constructive read at the same time. You know, we all know racism is a complex, multi-layered issue. I don't think anyone has any debate on that, and all the history that's behind it has certainly been talked about here, and we're all pretty familiar with it. But when you really look at it, the definition of racism, I think, is where my head started at with this book. Is I have, maybe not deeply enough, have thought of racism, particularly earlier in my career, as bad people doing bad things on an individual basis to people that don't look like them, don't act like them, they have no tolerance for anything. And the reality is probably, certainly that's racism, but I think that historically, what we, I think particularly in the white world, struggle with is that society has been placed, I'm going to say rigged, for lack of a better way of saying it, to keep power within the white race throughout history, through our government, through many things. And I think that that is the uncomfortable truth that many people struggle with, and probably part of what triggers an interesting, more visceral reaction to the book, I think, for some of my white colleagues. And it kind of made me do a little bit of thinking back, okay, why do I feel this way? Why do I feel almost defensive with some of this? I consider myself to be a very progressive guy. I certainly don't consider myself to be a racist, but I felt uncomfortable. Why? And, and I really started to think back on this. It's like, you feel like you're just not comfortable talking about this. And I think that we have to get comfortable there and develop the racial stamina. I think that was a term I heard that came out in this book, to be able to talk about this and then get feedback on places where maybe we're doing things that are offensive that we're not even aware of. I can't recall which of the panelists talked about. I think it was Dr. Simon, about the lady with the long hair that was I can't recall, but it was clearly an offensive comment that that probably wasn't even perceived by, it was the author of the book who actually said this, but clearly hit a nerve. And to have the courage to be able to take that kind of feedback from somebody rather than just have it go back into the shadows, it has to come out, or I think it's going to just continue to bubble in the shadows and we don't get anywhere. And I think when you, at least when I compare to some of the other reads, I think I've read Medical Apartheid in a lot of journals, and I've been through an awful lot of the training classes through diversity inclusion. But for me, I thought this read was a little more, I'm going to say in the face, maybe a little bit, with some of the things from a white male perspective. I think this particular group is a much more progressive group, but I think that others reading it might find this really challenging, which I think is a good thing. I can't say I've really read any book like this before, quite to this level. And a lot of the books I'd say that I have read almost had kid glove approach to a lot of the issues around racism, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it. They didn't seem to really hit at the issues, at least from my perspective. So I was even thinking about, just from a healthcare professional, about how this is so important. We talked about the healthcare disparities, but there are so many pieces to this, from taking care of patients, that we in the medical profession still struggle with greatly. And I know even in my clinical career, I have no doubts there were times where I was not connecting with the patient the way I really could have, because there's something in the communication, whether it be me listening or me just not understanding or vice versa, that led to potential outcomes I would say were not favorable. And I'm really pleased to hear that medical education is doing more and more work into this. Obviously, the esteemed panelists here that teach our future physicians, I think, are far more advanced, I think, than where I was 30 years ago when I started out. But to me, that's where it starts. I think Taylor said it well. We have to start at the ground roots level and continue to teach this, challenge us to do better, and address the issues that lead to some of these implicit biases and other things that cause problems for our patients. And I was thinking about where do I go from here with material like this? You know, I've been thinking back and forth on this quite a bit, to be honest. I love what Karmanos has done with the book club. And I think just starting the discussion, oftentimes that's the most difficult thing, because these conversations can be challenging and difficult, but we just have to start. I think I'm going to talk to our people over at the medical group about trying to do something similar. We don't have the same level of academic expertise that's on this group, or I'm sure on the listeners on the call, but that shouldn't preclude us from being part of the discussion and really listening and trying to learn from each other. So I appreciate the opportunity to be on the panel. I look forward to the discussion. But those are probably some of the main takeaways that I didn't hear mentioned earlier from some of my esteemed colleagues.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. And gosh, we are so much on time, and I'm looking for those 51 participants, and I know some of the participants that have thoughts and reflections and questions and comments. I'll start off the questions. I have a couple that I've been trying to take notes to break the ice. I kind of think of this as the Detroit Today show, that there's call-ins. So write in, you know, we're in a nice room together, and write in your question, and we'll field it and we'll discuss it. And this is a safe place to talk. Now, maybe oh, I see somebody put in a question. Good, I got a response. So here a couple of comments, and perhaps not directed to any particular panelist. And so why don't I open up with the audience comments, and I'll throw my question as well. So there's a comment: will the ongoing changes in demographics reverse current majoritarianism once the future majority gets empowered? And we, in politics, we of course talk a lot about that whites are no longer going to be the majority. So that's the first part of the comment. I wonder if there's any reaction that seems to be kind of a more political based question.
Yeah, this is Mark Schweitzer. I think a lot of what's happening now is kind of the death rattle of the future minority. And I fear for the next 5 to 10 years, as the country changes and that people become even more afraid. I fear that.
Yeah, I have a perspective from my time in New Mexico where whites are already the minority in New Mexico. And it's a ray of hope, I think, with this, and that, you know, it's the Hispanic population there that certainly is the majority, but there is a bit of a melting pot there between Native American as well as our Black colleagues and other Asian colleagues. And the representation I've seen through the medical community when I was there was not all people who looked like me. It really was a rather diverse group. I'm not saying it was perfect, but it did give me hope that as we continue to evolve, because Dr. Schweitzer is absolutely right. I mean, we have changes coming, and it's going to be sooner than later. There's already some examples out there where I think there's been some changes to that area, and I think it actually it shows some potential for positive.
I just wanted to make a quick comment. So yes, I do understand the fact that, minority populations are now becoming the majority. But I do want to sort of push back and say that white supremacy never needed numbers, right? Racism doesn't need the numbers. It just needs the access to the power structures. So yes, we will see a reality in which there are going to be more folks of color than there are white people. But until we do the work to undo the systems, not much will change in the fact of who has access to what. Because it's already been a fact that there are more folks of color in the world than there are white people, but we still have, this hierarchical system. And then I also want to kind of relay the fact that just because there are more diverse people in the room doesn't actually mean that that space is devoid of racism or white supremacy. Like, diversity is not really, it's sort of just like an adjective, right? There are Black people here, there are Asian people here, there are white people here. But unless you get the folks to actually see each other and communicate on an even playing field, then diversity means nothing. It just means that there's a very multicolored room, right? You have to do more to sort of go to that. But to the original point, yes, I think numbers is not going to be necessarily an issue. It's the systems that have to kind of be flipped on their heads.
And that's what I was thinking as well. Certainly the examples of South Africa and a white minority with ruling over the far greater number of Black residents. Dr. Thompson wanted to make a comment. So as a colleague, and actually somebody that helped me think through this whole concept of the book club, I believe we're inviting her to speak, to make a comment. So Haley?
Oh, thank you, I appreciate that, but Taylor said it beautifully. And I kind of made a comment in a chat, I'm not sure if everybody saw it, there are already many cities, many areas where, whites are already in the minority. That doesn't make a difference in light of structural racism or systemic barriers. That's all.
No, I really appreciate that. And certainly we're in a Black majority city, and, apparently structural racism in the medical care structure is standing as well as the rest of the structure. So my question had to do with medical education or comment that, we talk about structural racism in medicine and medical care is one of the major structures in our country and across the world. And maybe from the perspective of, both the leaders of medical education there on the panel, other physicians, and from a medical student. So, what are your first three requests for changing medical education, for making a change to, sort of how to give up some of that power that Taylor so eloquently spoke about? I don't know if we want to start from, maybe let's start from our student, because we could probably learn the most from her.
Okay, yeah, hi, I'm the resident medical student. So I think one of the biggest ways that you sort of have to relinquish power is, as a Black medical student, I think oftentimes they talk about this, it's an established term, but there's a minority tax, right? The fact that I'm here today and I took a 3-hour exam, and probably most of my white colleagues are like sleeping or at a bar, there's an extra work that comes with just being in this setting. And so I think a major way to sort of relinquish power, or to honestly support, is to kind of honor the extra labor that has to get done by minority medical students. A big source of fatigue for me is just the constant performance, right? I've never had to speak about different issues. I was talking to a friend the other day, and I was like, as the president of the Black Medical Association, Black History Month is one of the most exhausting months. Like, everyone wants to do a screening, everyone wants to do talk and all of these things. And I think a big way to relinquish power is offer ways to really support. So whether that looks like more funding to like BMA specifically, or heeding the mental health requests of students, it's really kind of just listening and acknowledging the fact that specifically your minoritized students in medicine have an extra lift. Right? And what are ways in which we can support them in that lift? How are we asking them too much and not necessarily supporting them? Having conversations, And then providing faculty that they can look up to and have mentorship in. And that's a really, really hard one. There's not a lot of folks who, especially in my circles, are able to find adequate mentorship from physicians and attendings who are not already overtaxed. And so just looking at those small dynamics, I think specifically in medical education, along with the nature in which we are training. So like who are giving us expertise? Are there ways in which specifically Detroit community can serve as that expertise? Are we bringing them in? And yeah, just looking at the small details and listening to students. Students always know what's up.
Well, from my point of view, it's in graduate medical education. It's first we have to hire people that look different than white people, and then we could recruit people that are diverse, that want to come to be residents in our programs, because we're creating a safer environment. And so ACGME is very interested in safety in medical education, as well as inclusion and diversity. And I think those fit together quite nicely, actually. So first you make an environment that feels okay, that I want to go to if I'm a Black medical student, that has mentors. I think you said that. Then we give power to those faculty who then become deans. I mean, it's not going to happen this year for sure, and it's not going to happen in the next couple years. But we have to start. Well, we have to continue, because I think we have started already. But and sharing power is not lip service. It's not saying, well, it's nice that you're here in the room. It's sharing power, making decisions, hiring people that are different than the white supremacy, the infrastructure that we are all part of.
And maybe I could focus the question a little bit more for Mark. I know a number of years ago, Wayne State was cited for not necessarily being open or friendly to medical students of color, and I know different changes have been made and a lot of efforts have been made in that regard. What things are we doing here at Wayne State? How can we be on the cutting edge, being in a Black majority city?
So I would say three things. So thing one is we've made pretty tremendous strides. So last year, the AAMC rated us as the 26th most diverse medical school in the country. And based upon our admission stats this year, we're likely to be somewhere between 15 and 20. And understanding that the top 10 are HBCUs predominantly, I think that's a manifestation of how much effort, time, and resources we've put into that. And the second way is pipeline programs. The issue occurs long before a given individual applies to medical school. The barriers to getting to medical school start probably in elementary school and just accumulate after that. So we have pipeline programs for elementary students, elementary school students, high school students. We have the oldest post-bac program in the country. President Wilson started the Med Direct program to take kids right out of high school and guarantee them admission to medical school. We just had our PhD underrepresented grant re-upped. I think it's been around for 30 years. Joe Dunbar has been the PI for that. Three of us submitted a proposal for the first grant, and it was scored pretty well. It's kind of borderline funding, but I see the issue as a pipeline issue. And then we hire so few faculty each year that it's unfortunately the complexion, no pun intended, changes over a very gradual period of time. And so I think our best route is to get students into pipeline programs, understand that this under-recognized talent is going to be ultimately really beneficial to the school, which we do, and then keep them here as residents and then encourage the residents to be faculty. And the last thing is we're starting a 3-year MD program. And this 3-year MD program, you'll not only finish in 3 years, but you'll be guaranteed the residency of your choice at application. And this is specifically, again, geared towards underrepresented in medicine. And that should allow a lot of talent to come to Wayne State, because saving that year, saving the money, the loans for that year, having an additional year of income, and relieving the stress of having to apply for residency, I think would be very appealing. So we're trying, and we are very cognizant that the choke point is not the admissions process of medical school. We're aggressive in that. The choke point occurs 4 to 15 years before that.
Okay, wonderful. Let me put out another comment, and then maybe some of our other panelists will want to address this. From one of my colleagues, I think there is value in recognizing that racists have historically at times been upstanding community leaders. Parentheses, see Origins of the Klan. I think this is important because it's easier to talk as racism as a system, about racism as a system, rather than racists on the individual level. Racists are often classified as, quote, other, equivalent to the boogeyman. Would love to hear any comments about this. So I guess maybe, the book was talking really about racism as a system, and it's not just the person that's the boogeyman or the obvious racist or uses inappropriate language, but sort of generalizing it to the progressive white person. What about, I guess, comments about racism, the leaders in our community?
It brings to mind the Shakespeare quote, "One may smile, smile, and smile and be a villain." What is it, from Hamlet, I think?
Yeah.
I believe you're right.
Yeah, great to talk about it. Theater and other books in the book club. Anybody else have any comments about that, or?
Well, I think to add to this, I think this is where white people need to call this out when they see it. I think this is part of the white fragility piece where and I think it was alluded to, the silence, if you will, or I can't remember the exact term, that silence basically allows acceptance of that kind of behavior. And that's where I think we need to step up and call it what it is. That's where you handle a lot of these individuals. And I think that's where we've had a lot of fallacies in the past.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I have a comment, and I think that it is that it's up to white people to speak up when we see it and when we feel it, and not allow people that are different to be unsafe. And I had an experience, this is a number of years ago, more than 10, in which I was asking the maintenance supervisor to set up the chairs in the auditorium for one of our residencies. And that particular residency had a lot of Muslim physicians in the residency. And he said to me, because I was white and he was white, he said, "Oh, they don't need chairs. They're used to, they're camel jockeys and they're used to sitting in the sand." And I was so dumbstruck that I didn't say anything. And later I reported him. And then because I like came back to myself and went, "Are you kidding me?" And so I reported him, and he then had to come and apologize to me, which seemed like the wrong response, really. But we did have a conversation about it, and he didn't like me ever after, essentially, right? Because I got him in trouble for what was, that white solidarity that you were talking about, Michael, in the beginning.
Yeah.
He thought it was okay to say that to me because, I'm there with him. And so I think it's important that us bystanders speak up at least and deal with it. And sometimes you can do it right away, and sometimes you have to do it later. after, you can think about it, what the best way to do it is.
And maybe the important thing is to think about it and to really think it through and talk to your friends about it. And actually, the author, the encounter that I mentioned before, she called the Black web advisor to discuss it, talked to some of her white friends and sat down and thought it through. So having us all think and talk. So I want to read a comment. I don't want to ignore any comments if possible. There is a good question. So 2 quick comments. So from undergrad, and I'm so glad we have undergrad participation. As an undergrad, through my sociology education and my scholarship with the Ronald McNair Scholars Program, our academics spoke of the need for preparation to academically and psychologically prepare for white backlash as minorities were rapidly becoming the majority and white populations would resist causing significant upheaval. Since then, for myself, being of the minority in class and ethnicity and gender, the last few years have demonstratively reflected this caution and worry. I think we touched on this, but any comments on this call-in or question or comment? Okay, let me oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I wanted to respond. I just couldn't hear you. Is there some place where it's written?
Yes, there is. It's in the question and answer. It's question and answer. So please, actually, for the panelists, I think this is kind of multimedia, and you could, it's not like you're trying to be on a cell phone in the same room at a tumor board, ignoring the discussion, while you're looking at your cell phone. We all are on our computers, and this is where we belong. And so please respond to some of these. Okay, so another comment. I used to hire a lot of people in Macomb County government. Our HR department couldn't recognize that in our direct service programs, health department, community action agency, senior citizens, et cetera, we needed to have a workforce that resembled the rapidly changing population we served. They all agreed in principle, but feared operationalizing that perspective as potential reverse racism comments. And actually, maybe we could get some comments from the panel, because basically DiAngelo says, no, there's no reverse racism. This isn't occurring. Whites aren't experiencing racism, the majority or the group in power. Does anybody have a comment about reverse racism?
Yeah, I have a comment. I kind of want to bring in both questions because I was just able to read both of them. So reverse racism is not a thing. So from a sociology perspective, racism in its notion is like a power dynamic. And in order to be racist against someone else, you actually have to have societal power over that individual. And so because of that, Black people cannot, or people of color cannot be racist against white people because the system is set up so that white people have more power than Black people. That is on like a academic, sociological, terms. But oftentimes, reverse racism is sort of like a defense mechanism that she calls out many times in the book. And the reality is it doesn't exist. Now, to answer and to tie that into the question about being a minoritized student in white spaces and seeing that upheaval, or seeing that fear. I want to validate that feeling because it can be very, very real. And in terms of preparing and sort of like, preparing for that reality, something I said earlier on the call is the more and more, I guess, as a minoritized person, you kind of grow up in this world, right? Especially in academic spaces. You kind of move from a space of, am I going to say the right thing? Should I not say anything? To the point where you're like, I'm not really here to make white folks comfortable. And so I would just say, it is really difficult. It's a really difficult space. And I would say pay attention to your mental health, especially if you're in majority white spaces, talking about sociological topics and talking about racism, because it's very easy to kind of pour your whole soul out and try to, really kind of get through to people to be met with like a brick wall, right? So you have to sort of kind of tailor it to each different position, and sort of push back when you need to, and then don't when you can't. And then I also wanted to bring up another point that was talked about earlier, in regards to medical education. I just want to kind of say that for medical education and for these systems of power to really change, it's going to take, large scale efforts to make the whole environment more supportive for minoritized students. And so while I do think it's important to have programs like Postbac, like MedDirect, and other programs that specifically cater to minoritized students, specifically in Detroit, those programs are also very, very exclusive, right? And so what are some other ways in which that we can have a large scale reckoning of, all right, how do we open the doors so that more folks of color can come in? And then it also translates to, once they get to medical school, once they get to these situations, it is, like this individual said, it is very hard to be the only person of color in a majority white setting, especially in academia. And so what are ways that we can support them? This means funding offices of diversity and inclusion. This means funding, counseling. This means funding and putting our money and our power towards structures that allow folks to stay and be fulfilled and get internships, get the residencies they want, stay in Detroit. I mean, I can't tell you how many folks who I know who have gone through different programs and can't really afford to be in the city anymore, can't afford to live the life of a physician that they want to, because they've either been so burnt out or they don't have the resources. And so just to kind of tie it in full circle, being a minoritized person in a white academic setting is difficult. You're going to get a lot of things like, oh, reverse racism. Oh, this isn't real. Oh, this is a reckoning. And I just say, gird your loins, listen to your mental health, but also, in the rooms in which you're speaking to stakeholders, have the power conversation, have conversations about ways we can support folks more holistically in historically white environments like academic medicine. Hopefully I answered all of those questions. I took me a minute to read, so I'm so sorry if I didn't get to your full points, but yeah.
No, I think those are really good points. I want to bring up the concept, and actually there's a couple of really good questions and comments I don't want to miss. The concept of reparations. I know it's a really hot political issue, and I know that they're doing reparations in Evanston. And actually, as a child of a Holocaust survivor, I know full well that Germany has paid monetary reparations for years. Maybe it doesn't bring people back, it doesn't bring lives back, but monetary reparations. Actually, I know personally that the government of Austria, in fact, is inviting people to become full citizens that are children or descendants of survivors, and I have my Austrian citizenship pending. Not that I'm leaving Detroit. So what about reparations? What about real money? Do we think the government's going to go for that? Is our society going to go for that? It seems like Taylor has made a call for that. What about some of the positions in leadership? How about McLaren leadership? I think I was focusing on Dr. Rowe.
Yeah, I think from reparations perspective, I know that's a charged issue, but to me, we have to do something in that. I mean, I hate to play politician because I don't consider myself to be one, but it just seems like it's the right thing to do. I mean, the country was built on the backs of slaves and others that were clearly taken advantage of over time. And I think that a lot of opportunities have been given to white people over time that Blacks and others have not had. I mean, money doesn't bring it all back, but I'd be curious just what makes sense in something like that, because that's the part. Is it money? Is it something else that would actually help to level the playing field? That's the part I guess I don't fully know, but I do think something should happen. That's my own personal opinion.
Yeah, I think if you think about medical education itself, one way to deal with that is, and I don't know how we do this, but investing into the students huge amounts of loans. So perhaps, and we're looking at some ways to do that now, like, do you give them, signing bonuses like physicians get? Do you pay part of their tuition if they stay with a corporation, to be a practicing physician? Do you You know, if we had the will in this country, we could pay for every person to go to medical school, but we don't choose to spend our tax dollars that way. So I think that there's lots of different ways to think about reparations. You know, how do we help our communities? You know, I've spent most of my time in Flint, which is a really kind of wonderful place, but very underserved. And well, we all know what's happened in Flint. So, you know, how do you help neighborhoods as a healthcare corporation to lift everybody up, right? So I think that I don't think we have the will in this country to do this with our money, but we could do that if enough people felt like that was the way to go. And you know, but that's not happening this year, I don't think. And you know, the other thing is that from a psychological point of view, Germany, for instance, is also doing the same thing where children and grandchildren can become citizens who were German Jews or descendants. And if you think about what they have done, and in South Africa, what they did is that part of reparations were airing what's happened. And we have never done that in this country. We haven't done it with Native Americans. We haven't done it with enslaved people. And and we know from Nelson Mandela's experience that, and Desmond Tutu, that can help a country move forward. And so that doesn't really cost money. You know, those are conversations. So from a psychological point of view, I think there's things that we can do to help each other. And then finally, I think she makes this point, but really the point is that we as white people lose out when we don't include other people of diversity, because we're not robust thinkers. It's just not the same when it's all white people making decisions and having conversations. So, you know, we lose out just a different way than people that are excluded lose out too.
You know, so thank you. That's really wonderful. And we have 3 more minutes. There was a number of wonderful comments in the Q&A, and please, everybody, take a look at those. And, you know, a question about understanding the evolution of Homo sapiens over the last 200,000 years to decipher why we act, why we do. I hope that doesn't lean towards hopelessness, because say, well, racism is never going to end. I can't do anything. What are we supposed to do? And I don't know, you know, and actually, as an oncologist, we can't be hopeless. We always have to be optimistic and hopeful. There's actually what seems to be a very good website addressing that issue. And you know, another comment talking about oppression since the Italian Revolution, and when Black slaves overthrew France, late 1800s. So, you know, these are long-standing issues. Maybe the last quick question I'm going to throw out, I don't know if we have time to come and answer, but what's going to happen in the morning after? Do you think the way we practice medicine now will change, considering the lessons taught in the book? Maybe for me, how can I look at my patients, or am I going to look at my patients or act differently? Or maybe just knowledge of this book will make me different. I don't know, any quick comments on that? Tomorrow in the office, in the clinic.
Yeah, so Mark Schweitzer, I would just say it always makes you better when your perspective is more wider and more open and exposed to more things. And you can practice diversity and equity and inclusion because it's right. But as Michael said, you can also practice it because it makes you better. There's a huge amount of literature on this, that corporations perform better with diverse boards, diverse leadership makes company, you know, if from a pure dollars and cents perspective, if you want to make it simple, it makes each institution better at whatever they intend to do. So if you don't believe it's right, at least believe because it's profitable.
That's wonderful. I think Barbara said that. I want to make sure she gets credit for that insightful comment. I might have said something like it.
Yeah, I've said it many times, so I must have heard it again. I apologize for not giving credit.
That's, you know, of course.
You know, one of the things that I have always done, and I continue to do, because psychologists get to have more time with people than physicians, but whenever I've had a person of color in front of me, I say, and when I first meet them, is it awkward for you to have a white psychologist? And often they say, oh no, it's fine. And then later we have a conversation, when they might figure out that I might be okay to have a conversation with. So opening the door, I think, has been something that's been helpful to me.
I think that's really interesting. And I think there's just so many things that medical professionals, and it's not just all about doctors, of course, it's about all of us, the genetic counselors, the social workers, nurses. There's so many things that we don't bring up naturally because we're uncomfortable. I find I need to ask people about their sexual health and their sex lives. And I do, and I'll ask, but sometimes I need to be reminded by my patient. And perhaps that's a really nice opening segue. And at least people know that you're thinking, there's, thinking about finances and health, that's not something that we naturally talk about, but it's important. So there's a lot of important aspects of this relationship between healthcare provider and patient. And I hope, as a final word, and I'm going to let Danny then close this out. I'll give him a second to unmute himself. As a final word, I hope this helps us become a closer knit healthcare community, and perhaps we're seeing. I had one comment from a research assistant I'm working with. I invited to join the conversation, and he said, "I didn't think they talk about these things in medical school." Really bright young man. Doesn't matter who, what race or whatever, it's just like a very, very bright young person said. And I said, yeah, we need to be talking about this. So Danny, if you could please close this off, because we could, of course, go all night.
Of course. Thank you so much to everyone for coming, and thank you everyone for joining in the discussion. We had so many good questions. We couldn't even get to them all. But I wanted to highlight really fast that our next 2 books have been selected. We will be taking a lot more suggestions, so if you have them, hold on to them. But our next 2 are going to be The Health Gap, The Challenge of an Unequal World by Michael Marmot, or it's Marmot, I'm not sure. Then December 16th, we're going to be looking at Dr. Damon Tweedy's book, Black Man in a White Coat, A Doctor's Reflections on Race and Medicine. So again, both of these titles will be at karmanos.org/book club if you need to get a refresher on those. Also, the exact dates and times will also be on karmanos.org/book club. But before we get too far away, I'm also going to put in the chat for everyone to have, there's a Qualtrics link for an evaluation survey, just to kind of see how this experience was for you, what we can do better. And also, this is your chance to input more book recommendations if you have been sitting on any of them. So once you click that link, it should open a new window for Qualtrics. It's just a few questions. It takes less than 2 minutes to fill it out. It'd be really great. Also, tomorrow morning, I'm going to be sending out a follow-up email to all of our attendees. There were so many great articles and YouTube links that were shared today that I'm scooping all those up, and I'm going to send them out along with our next dates, and to see what books, if you haven't thought of them, maybe you'll think of them tonight, and then we can get those suggestions scooped up for next time. So yeah, that's all for me. Dr. Simon, would you like to say anything else?
Thank you to everyone. Make sure you keep reading. The old phrase, drop everything and read, should apply to us in all aspects of our life. So that's my concluding statement.
Okay. Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you so much to all our attendees, faculty, community members, trainees, students. We've had such a wide swath of people, even though we've only had 50 some folks join us today. They've been from all over the place. So I really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll see you next time in September. So thanks so much, all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.